I knew the HOA was corrupt, but I didn't think they were stupid enough to trespass on my land and bury their sewage pipes without asking. Turns out, I gave them too much credit. It started when I noticed a patch of my backyard looking off. The grass was uneven, and there were signs of recent digging. I didn't remember authorizing any work, and since I owned this land outright outside of the HOA's jurisdiction, I sure as hell wouldn't have approved anything related to them. I grabbed a shovel and dug a little myself. It didn't take long before I hit something unnatural: PVC pipes. Big ones. Sewage pipes. I stared at the mess in disbelief. The HOA had buried their waste management system under my land without permission. That's when I heard the all-too-familiar voice of Vera Nichols, the HOA president, shrieking from the other side of my fence. "You need to stop that immediately, Kellan. That's community property." I wiped the sweat off my brow and looked up at her. Vera was standing there in her ridiculous pastel blazer, arms crossed, looking down at me like I was a disobedient child. "Community property," I scoffed. "This is my land, Vera. You don't own a damn inch of it." She sniffed and adjusted her pearl necklace. The board approved an infrastructure upgrade. The pipes were placed where it made the most sense. I leaned on my shovel. "Funny, I don't remember getting a say in that." "You don't live under HOA regulations, Kellan. That's why you weren't consulted. But this benefits the entire neighborhood, and I don't see why you're making such a fuss." I narrowed my eyes. "You buried sewage pipes under my land without asking. That's not a fuss, that's a lawsuit." Vera let out a fake laugh. "Oh, don't be dramatic, it's already done." "Moving them would be a nightmare, and frankly, that's not an option." I stared at her, feeling my blood pressure rise. "Not an option," she gave me a tight smile. "Exactly, so let's be reasonable, The board can offer you a small compensation for the inconvenience." I clenched my jaw. So that was their plan. Do it first, then throw some pocket change my way and expect me to roll over. "Let me think about it," I said, shoving my shovel into the ground. Vera smiled like she'd won. "That's more like it. I'll have the paperwork drafted." I walked away before she could finish. I already had a plan. And Vera wasn't going to like it, because those sewage pipes. They connected to the HOA's water supply, and I had access to the shut-off valve. The next morning, I called up a local contractor I trusted, Mitch, a guy who'd done some plumbing work for me in the past. I didn't give him all the details, just told him I needed to locate and assess some unauthorized piping on my land. He showed up within the hour, toolbox in hand, and got to work. While Mitch traced the layout of the pipes, I went inside and did my own digging, but mine was legal. I pulled up the county property records, cross-checked easement laws, and confirmed what I already knew. My land had zero shared utilities with the HOA. The board had no legal claim to run any infrastructure through my property. By the time I stepped back outside, Mitch had the whole picture. He laid out a rough sketch on a scrap piece of drywall he'd found in his truck, showing me where the pipes ran and, more importantly, where they connected. That's when I spotted something interesting: an access valve. Mitch pointed at it with his pen. "This right here. It controls flow to the section they buried on your property. If someone were to, say, shut this off, anything downstream would stop getting water." I nodded slowly. "And downstream means," Mitch gave me a knowing look, "everything on their side of the neighborhood." That sealed it. I shook Mitch's hand, paid him for his time, and told him I'd handle the rest. I waited until evening, when most of the HOA board members would be home. Then, with a wrench in hand, I crouched down near the access valve and twisted it shut. It didn't take much effort. With a soft clunk, the flow was cut off. Then I waited. The first sign of trouble came about an hour later. Lights flickered on in multiple houses as people realized they had no running water. A few residents stepped outside, peering around in confusion. 15 minutes after that, my phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. Half an hour later, pounding erupted at my front door. I opened it to find Vera, flanked by 2 HOA board members, looking absolutely livid. "Our entire system is down," she snapped. "We have residents without water." "Are you responsible for this?" I leaned against the door frame. "Responsible? No, but I do know why it happened." Vera crossed her arms, her composure cracking. "Then explain." I stepped outside, shutting the door behind me, and walked past them toward my backyard. By the time I reached the spot where the access valve sat, I could hear them scrambling to keep up. I gestured at the ground. Right there. That's the valve controlling the section of pipes you illegally buried under my property. One of the board members, a wiry man with thick glasses, adjusted his tie. This is a crisis, Kellan. You need to turn it back on immediately. I shook my head. No, I don't. You see, this whole system is an unauthorized installation. You never got permission, you never filed the proper permits, and you certainly never compensated me for using my land. So as far as I'm concerned, this isn't my problem. Vera's face turned red. You're causing a neighborhood-wide emergency. I folded my arms. No, Vera, you caused this emergency when you thought you could bulldoze over property rights like they didn't exist. You want water back, you move those pipes. The wiry board member cleared his throat. Moving them would take weeks. We have elderly residents, families with small children. I cut him off. You should have thought about that before trespassing. Vera took a deep breath, her voice dropping to a dangerously low tone. This isn't going to end well for you, Kellan. I met her gaze without flinching. Funny, I was about to say the same to you. She glanced at the valve like she was considering forcing it open herself, but she knew better. That thing was on my land. Tampering with it now would be a criminal offense. I'll be talking to legal counsel, she hissed before storming off. Good, I called after her. Tell them to bring a checkbook. With that, I turned and walked back inside, leaving them to stew in their own mess. This was far from over, but I had the upper hand. And I wasn't letting go. By the next morning, the HOA's crisis had turned into full-blown chaos. Residents were standing outside their homes, arguing and speculating about why their water had suddenly cut off. Some were on their phones, no doubt calling plumbers or city officials. Others were angrily pacing their lawns, looking toward the HOA's office for answers. Vera had a problem she couldn't contain. I grabbed a coffee and stepped out onto my porch, watching the show unfold. A few neighbors noticed me and shot curious glances in my direction, but none approached. Not yet. They were still trying to piece together what had happened. The HOA's emergency meeting was called before noon. Normally, they held their meetings in the clubhouse, but with tensions high, they moved it to the front lawn of Vera's house. A small crowd gathered as board members set up a folding table and stacks of paperwork. I could hear snippets of conversation from where I stood on my property. Vera was doing damage control, but it wasn't going well. One homeowner was demanding answers about why his entire sprinkler system had failed. Another woman was furious that she couldn't even flush her toilets. A retired couple was asking how long this was going to last. Vera raised her hands for silence and started spinning her version of events. She claimed there had been an unforeseen disruption to the neighborhood's infrastructure. She assured everyone that the board was working on a resolution. She dodged any specifics, but I could tell she was trying to buy time. That's when a voice cut through the noise. This wouldn't have happened if the HOA hadn't buried those pipes where they didn't belong. Heads turned, and I immediately recognized the speaker, James, a retired Army vet who had been one of the few people in the neighborhood who never liked the HOA's overreach. He was standing with his arms crossed, glaring at the board. I saw Vera's face tighten. She had been hoping to keep the details under wraps. A murmur spread through the crowd as people started whispering. Some already knew what he was talking about. Others were just now realizing this wasn't some random accident. Vera cleared her throat and tried to regain control. There were necessary upgrades made to improve the community's infrastructure, she said carefully. Unfortunately, there were complications that James cut her off. Complications? You mean like trespassing and installing pipes on private land without permission? Now people were really paying attention. Someone else spoke up, a woman I recognized as Lisa, who lived a few houses down. Wait, is that true? She asked, looking between Vera and the other board members. Did the HOA put those pipes on private property? Vera hesitated for a fraction of a second. That was all it took. A homeowner with 2 young kids shook his head. So that's why this happened. You guys cut corners, and now we're the ones paying for it. Tension rippled through the crowd as more people realized what was going on. Vera tried to salvage the situation. The board acted in the best interest of the community, she insisted. No one could have predicted this. I decided it was time to step in. I walked up, sipping my coffee, and casually leaned against the fence separating my land from the rest of the HOA's jurisdiction. I made sure my voice carried. "Oh, I predicted it," I said. "That's why I shut off the water." Every head turned toward me. Vera's eyes burned with barely contained fury. "Kellan," she said through gritted teeth. "This isn't the time." I cut her off. "It absolutely is. Your board thought they could bury infrastructure on my land without permission. They didn't even bother asking, and now that it's backfired, you're trying to spin it like this was just some unfortunate mistake." More murmurs. People were staring at Vera now, waiting for her response. Lisa frowned. "Wait, you shut off the water?" I nodded. "Sure did, that access valve. It's on my land. HOA doesn't own it. So when I found out they'd been using my property like it was their personal utility hub, I decided enough was enough." A man in the crowd shook his head in disbelief. "You mean to tell me we've been paying HOA fees for water management, and they don't even have legal control over where their pipes are?" Vera's jaw was clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. James let out a low whistle. "So we've been paying for stolen utilities." "That's rich." The crowd was turning. A woman pushed forward, her expression furious. "I have a baby. I need running water. How long is this going to last?" I raised an eyebrow. "That depends. The HOA can move the pipes and restore everything the right way. Or they can keep pretending they have authority over land they don't own. Their choice." Vera knew she was losing control. Her voice rose. "This is extortion. You're holding the entire neighborhood hostage." I laughed. "Extortion? That's funny coming from someone who buried pipes on my property without asking." Lisa spoke again, her voice sharp. "Is that even legal?" I pulled a folded document from my back pocket, the county records I had printed earlier. I held it up for everyone to see. "According to property laws." "No, it's not. And if they don't move them, I'll be filing trespassing charges." The crowd erupted. Homeowners shouted over one another, demanding answers. Some were calling for an immediate vote to remove Vera and the board. Others were talking about lawsuits. A few were arguing about whether or not they could withhold their HOA dues over this. Vera looked trapped, her face pale. I leaned in just enough to make sure she heard me. "You tried to force my hand," I said quietly. "Now it's your turn." She swallowed hard, her confidence crumbling. She knew she had no good options left. The HOA board meeting dissolved into chaos. Residents shouted over each other, demanding answers. Some were furious at Vera, others at the entire board. A few were still trying to process the fact that their water had been running through an unauthorized system, buried under land that didn't even belong to the HOA. Vera's face was locked in a grimace, her hands gripping the edge of the folding table in front of her like she was physically holding herself together. The tension in her shoulders made it clear she was realizing, in real time, just how badly she had miscalculated. James stood with his arms crossed, watching the board members squirm. Lisa had her phone out, tapping furiously, probably looking up legal consequences for what had just been revealed. The man with young kids was shaking his head, muttering something under his breath. The wiry board member, the one who always dressed like he was heading to a corporate meeting, adjusted his tie and tried to regain control. "There's no need for hostility," he said, his voice straining to sound authoritative. "We can resolve this in a civil manner." James let out a sharp laugh. "Civil, like how you bulldozed someone else's land without permission." Lisa turned her phone toward the crowd. "I just looked it up. If they installed infrastructure without proper permits or approval from the landowner, that's illegal. They could be fined or worse." A woman with a toddler on her hip frowned. "Wait, does that mean the HOA fees we've been paying for maintenance were going towards something that wasn't even legally placed?" Vera sucked in a deep breath, straightening her blazer. She was trying to keep her voice even, but the cracks were showing. "The board did what was best for the community," she said. "We had no reason to believe this would become an issue." I stepped closer, making sure my voice carried over the crowd. "No reason. You knew this wasn't your land. You knew you didn't have permission. You just thought I wouldn't catch on until it was too late." The murmur in the crowd shifted. Some people had been holding back, unsure where they stood. But now the realization was setting in they had been lied to. A man in a polo shirt spoke up. So what happens now? If the pipes are illegal, do we have to pay to fix this? I answered before Vera could spin it. Nope. The HOA is responsible for fixing their own mess, but if they don't, I'll be filing a lawsuit first thing Monday morning. That sent another ripple through the group. Some homeowners looked ready to storm the board members themselves. Vera clenched her jaw. We need time to discuss this internally. The board will issue a statement soon. James took a step forward, voice sharp. No, you'll answer now. The community deserves to know how you plan to fix this. The wiry board member looked like he wanted to vanish. We need to consult legal counsel before making any definitive commitments. Lisa's eyes narrowed. You didn't consult legal counsel before you buried sewage pipes on private land. Vera's silence was all the answer anyone needed. A woman with graying hair shook her head. This is ridiculous. I say we hold a vote. Right now. That set off another round of voices rising in agreement. Vera's eyes widened. That's not how this works. James crossed his arms. Pretty sure we can hold an emergency vote if the board is acting against the interest of the community. And right now, you're looking real guilty. Panic flickered across Vera's face. The other board members weren't faring much better. One of them, a man in his 50s who had been silent this whole time, suddenly cleared his throat. I was not involved in the decision to install those pipes, he said quickly. Vera shot him a glare, but he wasn't the only one starting to distance himself. Another board member, a woman with short cropped hair, shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should reassess our approach. The crowd was gaining momentum and Vera was losing control. Lisa raised her voice. All in favor of holding a vote to remove the board, raise your hand. Hands shot up all around. Vera's face paled. You can't do this. James was grinning now. Looks like we just did. The wiry board member tried to salvage what was left. We need an official process. This isn't valid. Lisa didn't back down. Fine, we'll file the paperwork first thing, but in the meantime, you're not making any more decisions on behalf of this community. The energy had completely shifted. Vera was no longer in control. I turned to her, voice calm. Now, about those pipes. You can pay to remove them and restore my property, or you can wait for the lawsuit. Your call. She didn't answer. She just stood there, gripping the table, watching as her entire power structure crumbled around her. The crowd started breaking off into smaller discussions. People were already making plans to organize a new leadership team. Others were talking about how they'd been suspicious of HOA finances for a while. Vera stepped back, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. James clapped me on the shoulder. Well, that was satisfying, Lisa grinned, and we're just getting started. I glanced back at the ditch where the pipes ran under my land. This wasn't over yet, but one thing was clear: Vera's reign was finished. And I was going to make damn sure the HOA never pulled something like this again. Vera was gone, but the fallout was just getting started. After the emergency vote, the HOA board collapsed like a house of cards. 3 members resigned within hours, wanting nothing to do with the legal mess unfolding. The rest clung on in hopes of damage control, but the residents weren't having it. By midweek, a petition had circulated to formally remove the remaining board members, and it had more than enough signatures. Meanwhile, Vera had gone radio silent. No emails, no announcements, not even one of her usual passive-aggressive newsletters. It was clear she was scrambling behind the scenes, likely trying to salvage what little power she had left. I wasn't waiting around to see what she'd do next. The morning after the vote, I called a property lawyer, a sharp guy named Brennan who specialized in land disputes. I explained the situation, sent over the documents I had gathered, and within an hour, he confirmed what I already knew: Vera and the HOA had no legal footing. In fact, they were in worse trouble than I initially thought. Not only had they trespassed, but since they never filed permits for the sewage work, they had violated county regulations. If I wanted, I could escalate this beyond a civil lawsuit and involve the local government. Brennan assured me that a cease and desist letter would be on its way to the HOA by the afternoon. The moment they received it, they would be legally obligated to stop using my land for their utilities. If they didn't comply, I could sue for damages. I had them cornered. That afternoon, I took a walk around the neighborhood. Without Vera's iron grip, homeowners were finally talking openly. Conversations that had once stayed behind closed doors were now spilling into front yards. I overheard an older woman telling her neighbor about how the HOA had been raising dues without proper votes. Another man was complaining about mysterious administrative fees that had been tacked onto his monthly payments. Lisa and James were already working on gathering financial records. They had demanded access to the HOA's books, and with Vera gone, no one was left to stonewall them. What they had found so far wasn't pretty misallocated funds, unexplained expenses, and blatant misuse of community money. The HOA wasn't just corrupt, it was crumbling from the inside out. By evening, Brennan called with an update. The cease and desist letter had been delivered, and the HOA's remaining leadership had less than 48 hours to respond. If they didn't, we'd move forward with legal action. I didn't have to wait long for a reaction. Just before sunset, I spotted a familiar figure standing at the edge of my property, Vera. She wasn't wearing her usual polished blazer. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and the confident posture she always carried was gone. She looked smaller, like the weight of the situation had finally settled on her shoulders. I walked over, stopping just inside my property line. She hesitated before speaking. Her voice was quieter than usual, lacking its usual sharpness. "We need to talk," I crossed my arms. "About what?" She inhaled slowly, as if trying to steady herself. "You've made your point, the board is finished, the HOA is in turmoil, but this situation with the water, it's hurting people who had nothing to do with it." I didn't say anything, waiting to see where she was going with this. She continued, avoiding eye contact. "I'll make you a deal. You turn the water back on, and I'll personally make sure the pipes are removed from your property." I studied her for a moment. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something resembling desperation, but I wasn't about to take her word at face value. "How?" I asked. "You don't even have control over the board anymore." She let out a slow breath, finally meeting my gaze. "I still have influence, enough to push through an emergency repair order before the new leadership takes over." I raised an eyebrow. "And why would you do that?" Her jaw tightened. "Because if I don't, this whole thing will escalate beyond repair. You and I both know the county will get involved soon. If this turns into a legal battle, it won't just be the HOA that suffers. Homeowners will be stuck in the fallout, and I don't want that on my conscience." I wasn't sure I believed the last part. Vera wasn't the type to care about collateral damage, but I did believe she was trying to save herself from further humiliation. I considered my options. Leaving the water off was punishing the board, but it was also affecting innocent families. And if Vera was actually willing to speed up the fix, that would save me time and money. I nodded slowly. "Fine, but I want it in writing. A signed agreement that guarantees the pipes will be removed within the next 48 hours. She hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "I'll have the paperwork to you by morning." I watched her walk away, shoulders hunched, steps slower than usual. For the first time, she looked like someone who had lost. By morning, Vera delivered the paperwork just like she promised. It was a formal agreement, drafted hastily but legally binding. The HOA would be responsible for the full cost of removing the unauthorized pipes and restoring my property to its original state within 48 hours. If they failed, I had the right to escalate the matter to county authorities and pursue legal action for damages. I read through it carefully, making sure there were no loopholes, then signed my portion. Vera's signature was already there, her handwriting sharp but slightly unsteady. Once the paperwork was finalized, I turned the valve back on. The water flowed again, but the damage to Vera's reputation was irreversible. The neighborhood was still buzzing with discussions. With Vera officially out of power, residents were organizing to elect a new board. Lisa and James were at the forefront, making sure whoever took over wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. I had no interest in being part of the HOA, but I kept an eye on things from a distance. By midday, a construction crew arrived. The workers were subcontracted by the HOA, but they didn't seem thrilled about the job, probably because they knew they were fixing a mess that never should have happened in the first place. I stood on my porch, watching as they marked the ground and prepared to dig. One of the workers, a broad-shouldered man with a weary expression, approached me. He asked if I wanted to be present while they worked in case there were any concerns. I told him I'd be watching. As they dug, I saw the pipes being unearthed piece by piece. Thick PVC sections, stained from months of use, were pulled from the ground and stacked onto a truck. The sight was oddly satisfying. A few neighbors walked by, stopping to watch. Some shook their heads, muttering about how ridiculous the whole situation was. Others simply looked relieved that it was finally being fixed. James walked up beside me, arms crossed as he observed the work. He said it was about time someone stood up to the HOA like this. I agreed, though I wished it hadn't taken something this extreme for people to see how deep the corruption ran. Lisa arrived a few minutes later with a folder of documents. She had been digging through the HOA's financial records and found more discrepancies than expected. There were missing funds, unauthorized expenses, and payments that didn't match any actual services. She pointed out that Vera had been using HOA money for personal expenses, meals, travel, and even home renovations. James looked furious, saying that if Vera thought she could walk away from this without consequences, she was in for a rude awakening. Lisa mentioned that they were preparing to file a report with the county, and if the investigation proved misconduct, Vera could be facing more than just a ruined reputation. By late afternoon, the last section of pipe was pulled from my land. The workers filled in the trench, packed the soil, and smoothed it over. They assured me that within a few weeks, the grass would grow back as if nothing had happened. I shook hands with the lead worker and thanked them for handling the job professionally. He simply nodded, saying it wasn't the first time he dealt with an HOA making bad decisions. With the pipes gone, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Vera had lost everything she had spent years controlling. The HOA was in the process of being rebuilt from the ground up, and the residents were more involved than ever. Lisa and James planned to continue investigating the missing funds, and if what they found was serious enough, Vera would have more to worry about than just losing her title. As I stood in my backyard, looking at the newly restored land, I realized that this wasn't just about me winning against the HOA. It was about setting a precedent. No one would try to pull something like this again, not here, not while people were watching. Vera had thought she could get away with it. She had counted on no one fighting back. She had been wrong.